Somewhere in a London workshop, a craftsman is dyeing the pages of a book in leather made to look like dragon scales. Only 1,000 copies exist. Each one costs more than most people's monthly rent. And every single copy is signed by a 77-year-old man who has spent 15 years failing to finish the sequel to the book he is signing. That is not a joke. That is literally what happened this week. Welcome back. If you're new here, I talk about the business, the history, and the slightly absurd inner workings of the fantasy and geek world, and today we're talking about Westeros. Specifically, why a publisher just released a $900 more than your car payment edition of a 30-year-old novel, why fans think it is secretly a coded message, and why George R.R. Martin is somehow both the most successful and most frustrating writer alive. Let's get into it. On July 14th, a British publisher called the Folio Society released a new edition of A Game of Thrones. Not a new book, not new content. The same 900-page novel that started this entire universe back in 1996. But this version is built like it belongs in a museum, not a bookstore. 1,000 copies, 872 pages, $2,200 or about 1,500 pounds if you're ordering from the UK side. Every copy comes in a hand-built clamshell box. The binding is made from a custom leather designed to look and feel like dragon skin, developed specifically for this project. There is a fold-out map of Westeros tucked inside. There is brand new artwork throughout, painted by an illustrator named Jonathan Burton. There's an introduction written by fantasy author Joe Abercrombie, who is basically fantasy royalty in his own right. And on the limitation page, the page that tells you which number copy you own, the printing is done in actual gold foil, and Martin has physically signed every single one. The publisher's editor described the finished product as something that looks like it was pulled straight out of the Citadel library in the books themselves. And here's a detail that a lot of outlets skip past. The paper for this edition was custom-made by a mill called James Cropper, which has been operating in the English Lake District since 1845. That's not stock paper. That is a paper mill nearly 2 centuries old, making bespoke sheets for a fantasy novel. The bookbinding itself was done by a company called Ludlow Bookbinders, and according to the publisher, every copy is being bound by hand, one at a time. So why now? Why is a book from 1996 suddenly getting the royal treatment in 2026? Because this year marks exactly 30 years since A Game of Thrones was first published. And 30 years is apparently the threshold at which publishers decide a book has earned dragon leather binding. Now, if you're not deep into the lore, here's the fast version of why this specific book matters so much. A Game of Thrones introduced Westeros, a continent protected from whatever is lurking beyond it by a wall of ice roughly 700 feet tall. It introduced Lord Eddard Stark, a man who gets pulled into the political capital of King's Landing to serve his friend, King Robert Baratheon, right? As several other families start quietly plotting to steal the throne out from under him. That's it. That's the pitch. A guy gets a promotion he didn't want in a city full of people who want him dead, and the whole thing spirals into one of the most influential fantasy stories of the last century. Since it came out, the Song of Ice and Fire series has sold more than 90 million copies worldwide. The first book alone became the foundation for HBO's Game of Thrones television series in 2011, which ran for 8 seasons and picked up over 160 Emmy nominations, winning 59 of them. Whatever you think of how that show ended, and a lot of people have strong opinions about that, there is no denying it changed what television networks were willing to greenlight for the next decade. Here's something worth pointing out that most coverage of this book release completely ignored. This isn't just a random anniversary edition dropped into a quiet year. 2026 might be the single busiest year the Game of Thrones franchise has ever had. Think about what's happening in the same 12 months as this book release. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms just had its first season. House of the Dragon is airing its 3rd season. There's a stage play called The Mad King, which is actually the franchise's first official theater production. There's a strategy video game called War for Westeros. And there's a mobile game called Dragonfire. That is 2 television shows releasing new seasons in the same calendar year, which has genuinely never happened before in this franchise's history. Plus a stage play, plus 2 separate video games. So this limited edition isn't really standing alone. It's the print version of a much bigger media rollout, one designed to keep Westeros in front of fans across basically every format that exists: books, television, theater, mobile gaming, PC gaming. If you can consume a story through it, Game of Thrones is currently being delivered through it. Now here's where things get a little uncomfortable, and where I think the real story is hiding. This entire limited edition celebrates a novel that came out in 1996. The sequel to that novel, called A Dance with Dragons, came out in 2011. The book after that, called The Winds of Winter, was supposed to come out a few years later. It has not come out. It still has not come out. As of this year, some tracking sites have calculated that we have now been waiting for The Winds of Winter for the exact same number of days it took Martin to release all 5 previous books in the series combined. Let that sit for a second. The wait for one book now equals the wait for the first 5 books put together. Martin himself has confirmed he is still working on it, with reports putting the manuscript somewhere around 1,100 pages, but a fall 2026 release has already been ruled out by his publisher. Some industry watchers are now suggesting a realistic release might not happen until closer to the end of the decade. So when this dragon leather, gold foil, $2,000 edition of the first book quietly went up for pre-order back in June, the internet did what the internet does. A promotional post from the Folio Society ended with a strange little line: "One secret remains. Keep your eyes on the skies." Another message is on its way. Almost immediately, fans across social media convinced themselves this was a hint that Winds of Winter news was finally coming. Comment sections filled up with people insisting the wait was over. It wasn't. As far as anyone can confirm, that teaser was almost certainly just marketing for the special edition itself, not a secret announcement about the missing 6th book. But the fact that thousands of fans were ready to believe a coded message from a luxury book publisher tells you everything about how starved this fan base actually is for updates. People are pattern-matching gold foil and Instagram captions in a hope for a book that still doesn't have a release date. I think it's easy to look at a $2,000 book and just call it cash grab. And sure, there's an argument for that. But there's also something genuinely interesting happening here about how publishers are treating book releases the way studios treat film releases now. Limited runs, hand craftsmanship, exclusive extras, a built-in scarcity model where only 1,000 people on the planet will ever own this exact object. The Folio Society has done this before, with special editions of The Hobbit, The Never-Ending Story, and Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea books. But putting Martin's book in that same lineup says something about where this particular story now sits in the culture. It's being treated less like a novel and more like a piece of history. And maybe that's fitting. A Game of Thrones didn't just launch a book series. It reshaped an entire genre's relationship with moral ambiguity, political realism, and character death as a storytelling tool. 30 years later, publishers are willing to pay skilled leatherworkers and paper mills to build a physical monument to that. Whether or not you ever get your hands on one of the 1,000 copies, that says something about how far this story has traveled since 1990's IX.SO. Here's where we land. A 30-year-old book just got a $2,000 makeover. The franchise around it is busier than it has ever been, with 2 shows, a play, and 2 games all landing in the same year. And the one thing fans actually want, the finished 6th novel, is still nowhere in sight, no matter how many gold foil hints people think they're finding in marketing copy. If you want to see what 1,500 pounds of dragon leather and gold foil actually looks like, I'll leave images in the description. And if you've made it this far, you clearly care more about Westeros than is probably healthy. So hit subscribe, because we got more of these breakdowns coming. I'll see you in the next one.